I like
I'm
that.
stealing that term. Creator
There you
enablement.
go, creator enablement. Steal it. IP starting today. Trademark. I think that is the way that you diversify risk. Because
And how do I do it in a way that honors the investment of blood, sweat, and tears?
are we considered geriatric millennials? Is that what we
You
are?
know what? Legacy building mode, right? Like what?
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Marketing Adjacent. I'm Mike Grimberg. This is Gary Harrison with me, as always. And lots of stuff going on in the world today. And all of this is impacting how business leaders and really everybody, I think, lives and communicates and all that fun stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What got us thinking about the topic in general, and we've touched on it in past conversations, is this, put this article up for a minute. This article about the Web Summit. And apparently the CEO of said event and the company that puts on the event made his opinion public and heard and known on what's going on in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas conflict. And based on that, a number of really prominent venture capital firms and venture capitalists themselves have decided to pull out. Now, this was what, the 16th, so it's this is the 20th as we're recording this. I haven't followed the news too closely. I mean, I don't know if they've lost others, if they've lost sponsors, but along with this, unless you're living under a rock, I think you've probably seen things like a lot of the Ivy League schools losing a bunch of funding because of things happening there. Specifically, there's this one about the Wexler Foundation that pulled, I forget how much money from Harvard in particular. I'm trying to see, I'm looking at the article here. Let's see if I can find a number quick. It was a pretty significant amount. Now it doesn't say. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And it's yet another example of how our current politically, socially, racially charged global climate at this point. The last time, Garo, you and I talked about it, we were talking more about some local or national things happening in the US in particular. But how this climate combined with the sheer speed and scale of information dissemination due to social media, you put those two things together, and for a lot of corporate leaders and corporate communications teams, this is it's a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
Daily.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, last time you and I talked about this, we were talking about I think it was the Budweiser fiasco.
Mm-hmm.
Was it not Budweiser, Bud Light, right?
Yeah.
Where they created an informal, supposedly, campaign about things, and that made their stock completely tank, and a bunch of their customers leave, all this kind of stuff. And I remember what we netted out last time was, if you are going to create a visible, whether it's a campaign effort or a message or a statement,
Mm-hmm.
it needs to tie back to your core company ethos.
Right.
And company mission and vision, some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, you probably shouldn't do it. I'm wondering, with the things that are going on, I'm curious in your opinion, Gario, do you still think that's the case with what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I still think so, but my opinion on how companies should go about that has changed a little bit because of the impact and the second order effects that people don't think about that happen as a result. Um, there's one fallout from, I think it was the Harvard deal, where some CEO, and again, I'm totally blanking on the name right now, said that he wants the names of all the students that, you know, participated in a statement that was made because he wants to make sure that they're blackballed and never get hired, right? So think about that. Like, something a CEO is leveraging their platform to stop, whether or not you agree with the statement, and that's a broader issue for um, the purpose of a liberal arts education, right? Um, but to think that one CEO could impact the career trajectory of something, of an entire like student population or group, by one statement is worth noting as a part of this broader discussion, right? Because the platform can be used for good and it can be used for ill. And that's, I like the framing that you had on here about it's a double-edged sword, right? So um
Yeah, and I honestly wasn't even thinking about it in this sense that you're talking about. That's an interesting one as well. And maybe to add where my mind is going, last time I think we talked a little bit about people who are trying to get other people canceled, right? Like people are just
right.
looking for reasons to do it.
Mhm.
This is, I think, the first time where it's going the other way. Usually it's people trying to find, hey, what did the CEO say 20 years ago? Oh, here's this tweet. Like, nobody do business with XYZ company.
Yeah.
Right. Now this is the other way around where they see this CEO in particular. Actually, I saw it somewhere. I'm curious. I don't know if you know what the company was.
Yeah. CEO.
But
Keep talking.
this is the CEO coming out saying, hey, I want the names of these people. I don't think anybody should hire them. Like, we should cancel all these students.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting new development that I don't think was there before.
Yeah, this is the university to resign during. Yeah, I'll find it and
Yeah.
throw it in the comments. But I think back to your question about like, um, if the opinion has changed, it hasn't. I do believe that if your company has that ethos and there's a social issue that aligns with that ethos, your stakeholders are expecting you to have an opinion and to share that opinion, right? Um, the people, but it's as a fiduciary, as you know, on the leadership team or the CEO, like, you have a fiduciary duty to make sure that your personal comments do not negatively impact the broader stakeholders that are under your care, right? Whether it be customers, employees, or your shareholders, right? So you look at a company like Ben and Jerry's, they'll always comment on social issues because that's what you signed up for when you purchased their ice cream, right? Um, you know, and I think I think we need to start having like an honest conversation just as the business community. So I'm not talking about the social and just community in general here, or humans in general, because we do need to learn how to navigate at the pace of information as humans, right? There's no longer you wait till Sunday for someone to compile an opinion and spoon feed it to you on the Sunday late night show. Like, you're literally working through your thoughts and emotions in real time if you are active on the internet, right? And we have to acknowledge that, both ourselves to know that that's what's happening to us, but also acknowledging the fact that that's happening to other people, right? So who knows what those students had seen before they, or their lived experience that caused them to have that opinion. And that CEO, who's also online being very vocal and active, should acknowledge that fact and adjust accordingly, right? And I think that that's the part where I think the two things that I find myself wrestling with is an acknowledgement that my opinions, me personally as a leader, and as a business person, my opinions are shaped by my lived experiences and those around me, right? And while I'm not going to waver on my like beliefs, I still need to acknowledge the fact that my beliefs were formed by my lived experiences. And but as a result, someone else's beliefs may be formed by theirs, right? The second thing is, like, we got to understand that first and foremost, regardless of whether or not you're being pressured to have an opinion or share it or whatever it is, you still have a fiduciary duty to your stakeholders to be mindful of the things that you say and put out online. So the thing that is, I wouldn't call it concerning because it is what it is. The thing where I think a lot of folks are missing, as again, the lens of business folks, is they're working through their thought process in real time and think they have a duty, because people want to hear from them, to share their thought process as they are developing it. And that's where it becomes problematic, right? Because you haven't fully formed the opinion yet. And you haven't weighed all the pros and the cons. And you haven't talked to people who have a better perspective on the crisis of the moment at hand. You're just going off what you've read online or what you have read from what you consider a credible source, right? And that's where I think the problem lies.
Yeah, the interesting thing that I'm seeing over the last year, like the things we talked about before, I think are easier to make a more black and white recommendation statement. So whatever, call it, it could be LGBTQ, not rights, but in support of or against, whatever. It could be, even Black Lives Matter is another example of that, but more national, kind of more confined ideas and things. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now what we're seeing, there's two prominent examples of this in the last year. One's the war in Ukraine,
mm-hmm.
where all of a sudden there was this expectation that corporate leaders would take a stand. In this case, it's pretty, for the most part, for Ukraine, I would say. And they would do it openly. Mm-hmm. I would say that one is maybe a lot less politically charged because of all the U.S. history and the Cold War and, Russia's the enemy, yada, yada, yada. So mm-hmm. I don't think there's too much, nearly as much concern, but it was a global event, not happening locally. I mean, the Ukrainian population in the U.S. is pretty tiny. Mm-hmm. So it's not like there's a giant constituency locally or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But people were required to act. And now there's this. the,
Mhm.
the Israel-Hamas conflict that's happening right now. And the interesting thing to me when I think about it is this is no longer kind of a confined idea or ideology that's in support of or against a particular people per se,
Mhm.
although you can make the argument it is, but I think about it much broader.
Mhm.
This is a much bigger thing in my mind. Like this is are you pro violence or against it? This is a very much general thing that I think people are being forced to, or forced is maybe a harsh word, but to a certain extent, to take a stand on one way or the other. And depending on what you say, and again, I'm not like, I thought about it, right? I mean, I've got family and friends in Israel. We have a lot of friends that have had people that did not make it. Okay, I'm not going to get into all those details. That's not the point. If anybody's curious about my personal thoughts, the best place I can do is point you to the latest episode of the Sam Harris Show. What he describes in there, that's pretty much my line of thinking. We'll leave it at that. Okay. I put something out, but even me being an American Jewish business owner, I spent more time on that post that I put out there than on most other things I put out. And I edited and whatever, because I wanted to make a point, but I didn't want it to be inflammatory.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make it clear that it was about this bigger thing and not anything else in particular, right or wrong. I'll give you a couple other examples in recent conversations that I've had with folks. One is a business owner here who I know that did take a stand on it, very specifically said, we stand with Israel. And when we were talking about it, he's like, honestly, if there are people that don't want to do business with us because of this, they're not people that I want to do business with.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're a small business, right? This is not a
Yeah.
publicly traded corporation, so we have to take that with a grain of salt. Okay. One other story I'll tell you, which is somebody who works for Fortune 500. I'm not going to say which one. And this person has been very, very, I would say to the point of distraught. Maybe distraught's a little harsh, but upset at the non-response, public or private, that this company has had to this. I believe one of their first things was more than a week later, and it was a general email, very much fluffy. That's a long story short. It was like, here are 4 nonprofit organizations that you could donate to. 2 on one side, 2 on the other side. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen people both post like Microsoft put out a statement about it. We are there. We're in support of X. We're there for our employees globally, et cetera, et cetera. But it's been interesting to me who has made a statement and what that statement was, and who hasn't made a statement and what that statement was or wasn't, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
And again, it's bigger than Jews versus Muslims, Israelis versus Palestinians, in my mind at least.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the statements being made are forcing people to pick a side.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have more than these anecdotes to put in front of you. I'm curious, kind of as we were talking about, the more black and white of, hey, if this doesn't fit your ethos, you probably shouldn't post about it. This is not like whatever, climate change and Patagonia taking a stance because that's their thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's part of their ethos. At the end of the day, we're all humans and human beings. To me, this is more like this particular instance is more than just is this part of my ethos or not? Even though I was very much on board with you the last time we were talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious on your thoughts on this. And again, my context is these three specific scenarios. One of them is a personal one of mine.
Yeah, it's not the same thing, but it's similar. Um, you know, when there was all um, the racial tension around George Floyd's murder, there was
Mhm.
a lot of calls for commenting and a lot of, I'm going to be careful with the term. I'm using the term because it's how people framed it. But I know it's a lot more nuanced, but there was a lot of virtual signaling, right? I'm, you know, I stand with all my Black friends, right? Like there's a
Mhm.
lot of that going on. And my thing around that was that's great that you say that, but again, through the lens of business, right? Um, what are you doing to change, um, or positively impact the change that you are so publicly asking for, right? And it gets back to this idea that, you know, if you're if you have a business interest with the conflict of the day, right? That again, as a business leader, first and foremost, you have a fiduciary duty to your stakeholders, right? Really spend the time to think that all the way through, right? And now, to be fair, you got to have the conversations, right? But those conversations don't need to be broadcasted publicly, right? Like, you and I have had like offline conversations. And again, it's forming opinions, right? We're two guys that are fathers that respect each other, and we're just talking it through, right? That's what I think most leaders need to do. And whatever they decide, like you kind of have to go through kind of three stages, right? Like you have to look at what everybody's doing, what your stakeholders are expecting of you. Then you have to do the internal soul searching to determine where do you stand. And it's okay to stand that you are unable to make a stand. Like that's also an option, right? But then the next step in that whole process is to decide, does this does where I stand need to be a public statement, or can I do some work on the back end, right? And it's that last step that I think folks go from, there's an issue or a conflict and I have to make a statement, and they skip all that middle part that is mission critical if you are going to be a fiduciary of your organization. And you have to have like people surrounding you that you can have those like opinion forming conversations with, right? Like I got a text thread with a couple guys right now, and all we're doing is sharing back and forth um interviews and things that we're seeing, right? That's all we're doing. Like nobody's forming an opinion yet. Everyone's just trying to understand. Like I am not a Middle Eastern expert, right? But I have friends that are affected by this. So as a friend, my job as a friend to like those around me is to try and understand, right? That does not mean that now I have to like craft like an article and put a standout with the goal of like virtue signaling that this is my belief. That's not the job, right? So I think there is a need for a reassessment of the role of business leaders in the dialogue that we have, which is it's huge. Like it's not going back in the bottle, right? Like reporter, just the ecosystem of news, like is built for this. Like that guy, that CEO that made that statement, like he was all over the internet. Why? Because blogs need clicks, right? So, and reporters need to find stories to write about. So they're scouring the internet for narratives that they can then pull on. Those narratives are coming from somewhere, right? So we can't ignore it and say, hey, we're not going to be online and we're not going to be, you know, for lack of a better term, thought leaders around these current affairs. That's not an option. We got to be active. We got to be out there. We got to be kind of in the mix. But the way that we go about doing that needs to take into account the reality of the ecosystem that we're now finding ourselves. And a lot of executives are still operating from a world before we've realized the impact of social media in its current form. And we just can't do that anymore.
It's interesting. I think there's definitely an interesting thread to pull on of, does it need to be public?
There you go.
And I think the flip side of that is, which I think is why people automatically go from this is happening to I need to make a statement, is because I feel like we've evolved, not for the better, I don't think, as a society, where if you are not publicly making a statement, that means that you are not in support of, or that you are against whichever side you are, right? And I don't think that's true at all. On the flip side, it's interesting. So, another thought that I had is, you look at who made the statement and who didn't, etc. And you look at the statement that Meta put out. Now, I don't think it should be a surprise for anybody. Mark Zuckerberg is an American Jew. Okay. If you did not know that, sorry to break it to you. Now you know. All right. The state, I can't imagine that what he's thinking and the conversations he's had privately are much more focused and powerful than the statement that was put out by Meta, which was pretty much just, hey, we're taking care of our employees. That was the gist of it, and it came, I think 5 days in, kind of thing. So, thinking about it that way, there's some certain issues I think transcend business. So while I agree with you that as a CEO or a business leader or whatever, you have that fiduciary responsibility, I think it's 100% true. And if you don't want that, then get out of the hot seat.
Right.
But on the flip side, I personally struggle with reconciling these bigger issues I think we have as a society that I think transcend the business. Because the reality is we live in a world right now that is so freaking polarized for no damn reason, in my opinion. But there's nothing I personally, as a single person, can do anything about that. That's just the world and society we're living in. So this gets back to, again, is there a decision tree of, do I make a public comment or do I not? And here, I'll put this for you again. And I'm curious, and on the flip side, you mentioned the George Floyd situation that was happening a number of years ago. Look, you're in Minneapolis. you're a black entrepreneur in the US. There's no way that did not like cut you to the core. Right? And you and I have talked about it, so I know that. Me, I'm a Jewish American immigrant from former Soviet Union. I've got friends and family there. This was a shock, you know, and trying to reconcile my take my CEO hat versus I'm a human hat versus I'm a Jew hat. Like those are really hard things, and I don't know that I have the right answer even at this point, to be honest with you. You know, because most of our team is not Jewish, so there's that. Most of our clients are definitely not. There's that.
Right.
But I did feel like I couldn't say nothing.
Right.
And I don't know if that was right or not. I think it was, but I'm curious, you know, on your thoughts, like when all the George Floyd stuff was going on. Like, I actually don't remember. You and I weren't as close at the time, but did you put something out there publicly?
I have to go back and see what I actually did. I remember what I was going through at the time, because you know, there were three things that were kind of that I was wrestling with. The first was, you're right, being a black man in America, that was like a thing, right? Like just the emotions that came with all that, like was, you know, working through that. On the flip side, my dad's a cop, right? So navigating that in Jamaica, being a immigrant from Jamaica meant that my lived experience as an African American is very different. For all intents and purposes, I'm black in America, right? But I grew up in Jamaica, so I view the world very differently, right? And I remember wrestling with those three things, because we live in out in the burbs here, but we could hear the helicopters and we could hear the sirens and everything that was going on. And I remember a conversation I had with my dad, which informed how I approached navigating all this. Was he told me, a lot of people don't remember this, Jamaica was going through a pretty bad civil war back when I was growing up. And my dad was on the front lines as a cop during those times. And he said to me that he would come home, and as he passed through the checkpoints, he would kind of let his guard down a little bit until he got home, because he never wanted me as a kid to have to think through kind of all that, you know, kind of like we were talking about our kids, you know, we want to shelter them, we want to protect them from the world. There'll be more than enough time for them to deal with the world as it is, but we can protect them as long as we can. But he asked me something that changed what I am doing now in that regard. He goes, you can't solve everything. You can't solve every problem. So he said, when he was in my situation today, he thought, what is one problem that he can devote his career to that would solve or at least move the needle on the issue that's causing kind of the civil unrest in Jamaica. And he identified corruption in the police force as his thing, right? So he focused purely on leadership in the police force. And he asked me, like, what is your thing? And it has to align with everything that you're doing. It has to align with work. It has to align with family. It has to, you know, across the board. And I landed on, creating economic opportunity so that Andre, when he grows up, has an amazing network and can choose what he does with his career. He doesn't have to do anything. Like when I say, like, he doesn't have to say, I'm going to be a doctor because that's my only path. He'll have options. And everything that I've done from that point, I can trace back to that decision tree, right? So, but I've had conversations of explaining to people, like, everything that I just talked about, you can't throw that in a 160 characters, right? That's not a tweet, right? That's not a LinkedIn post that's just there. That's a conversation, right? And I think that's how I've approached it. I probably told that story like 100 times. Told it to the Silicon North Stars. I told it to venture capitalists that are now friends. I've told it to founders that were wrestling through the same thing. I've told it to colleagues that are white that are trying to make sense of everything that's going on. That's my narrative and my experience about the whole thing. Now they know what they do with it. Not that I don't care. I really don't care. Like this is my perspective. It's shaped by my lived experience, and again, I just have this conviction. So, I operate in a very different way. I operate from a place of integrity and clear conviction. So it doesn't really matter to me what other people say, including why aren't you saying anything about this, right? Because that's not it. That's not, if it's not in service of that broader goal of making sure that Andre has the options and the community and the network that allows him that, to leave the world better than I left it, and he for, his children, like that's the goal. And if a comment on social media isn't going to change that goal, right? If it's in service of it, absolutely. But if it's not, I don't need to do it.
I think it's really sage advice from your father and what you're sharing right now. It's I think I probably talked about it with you at least once before. It was Scott Adams's book, it was like How to Fail at Everything and Still Succeed. I think it was something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget the exact title. It's sitting right there. And Still Win Big. That's close. Anyway, one of the concepts he talks about in there is these kind of concentric circles of influence, where it's like you are in the middle, get your shit together first. Then it's, your immediate family, extended family, friends, community, etc. And it's interesting because all of these global issues and national issues and all these things, I mean, obviously some of them have more local impact, some of them don't. But it's finding those through lines to, I think, understand, is this important for you and can you do anything about it? In which of those spheres of influence are you influencing? Because if you're trying to solve the conflict in the Middle East, I don't care if you're Satya Nadella at Microsoft, you ain't gonna do it.
Mm-hmm.
So your statement shouldn't necessarily be about that if you were going to make a statement. Now, for them, it makes sense. They have, I'm sure there's an office in Israel. I know for a fact it is. Right? Probably a fairly decent sized one, right? Not to mention the investments and the startups and all this kind of stuff. So those pieces, it's understanding where is that sphere of influence that you have and do you need to make one, and as I'm thinking back kind of right now in this situation, for me, it's, I can't do anything to solve problems there. Right? I've got friends and family that I've personally reached out to. Are you okay? Can we help you? All that kind of stuff. Right? That's on the back end. Nobody needs to know about that.
Right.
Per se. But this is unfortunately spilling over to the streets locally. I've got friends here whose billboard ads, they're Jewish, were vandalized very purposefully. We don't need to get into the details, but it's clear they were the only ones in the area, the message on them and the stuff, right? So it's happening on here, like school security is changing, all this kind of stuff, right? So even though I can't do anything there, my statement, and again, this is more retroactive thinking, honestly, that I think I did before, is important because this is a local community issue just as much as it is a global issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a family issue as much as it is a global issue, for me, at least.
Yeah.
So, again, I think unless you have that kind of through line to pull, I think you should probably think very carefully about what needs to be public and what doesn't. And the other one is, if you're going to make it public, it's got to have something behind it. Because just putting, don't get me wrong, do I think it's nice to see people with the Israeli flag here and there? Sure, I guess. But if they're not doing anything about it, is it really adding any value? I don't know, probably not. Same with, same with the rainbow flags and the Black Lives Matter flags. You and I talked about that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, unless you're actually going to put your money where your mouth is, kind of thing,
right?
Is it really doing anything?
Right. Yeah.
Maybe that's. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say maybe that's where we wrap it, but it sounds like you've got another insightful thought to put out there.
No, I don't know if I call it insightful, but I've shared this. I shared this after George Floyd's murder with a few founders who were kind of navigating it as well, and I've been revisiting it myself just as I'm just sort of reflecting on the broader narratives that are being put out there, and even just trying to help people that are forming very strong opinions and are putting stakes in the ground that are very hard to undo, to really understand the unit economics of the internet and where their information is coming from, and how they process that information, and acknowledge the fact that their opinions and the things that they value are rooted in their lived experiences. So someone is going to have a very different opinion. And I pointed this out earlier, but this is a perfect example of, for all intents and purposes, I'm a Black man here in America, and everything that means as an adult. The talk that my dad had with me was very different from the talk that my buddy's dad had with them, right? It changes what we're able to navigate around and not make an issue, or what we do prioritize making an issue about, right? And I think the two books that I've been circulating and revisiting myself is Lives of the Stoic. So it's Ryan Holiday. He wrote a book, just basically the history of Stoicism, and just acknowledging the fact that throughout human history there has been struggle. The difference is that, like, the struggle is being lived and written in real time, right? So you're not hearing the survivors or the people that, I don't want to call it one, but the people who survived long enough to write the narrative about it, right? So I really like going back to Stoicism about that, because there's a lot of really good stories and anecdotes and information around that. And the second thing is Sapient, that whole series, because it focuses on humanity. And I remember it giving me this ability to just take a step back from my own emotions to assess what are the facts that I can identify, and then figure out the story that I want to tell myself about those facts, right? And those stories inform what I actually do. So I'll throw those books in the comments as well. But I found those to be really helpful as I'm working through. It was helpful after George Floyd's murder, and it's really helpful for me now.
Yeah, I think kind of really emotions can be so incendiary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for us as business leaders, as anybody that has a platform. It's not about hiding emotion per se, but I think it's being selective about when you share things to the broader world versus, again, those spheres of influence.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you sharing it with? And selecting which emotion you put out there and how you describe it and what story you tell about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're meant to make these quick, but this is an pertinent and I think incredibly important topic. So maybe I'll land the plane this time. At least I'm going to try. Usually that's your job. The last anecdote I'll share is I was having this conversation with this person whose billboards were just vandalized. And it was a conversation on, well, do we go to the local news with this? Which might get picked up nationally. Doubtful, but it could.
Mm-hmm.
Do we just go talk to our local community? And what they decided was, let's focus on the local community for a variety of reasons. But it just made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it isn't important, not that people maybe couldn't benefit from knowing this and understanding it, but the emotion that they feel is most pertinent to that local Jewish community. So that's what was decided. So I think not letting emotions get ahead of you, if you will, or get a hold of you before you put stuff out is really where I think we're netting out here.
Yeah.
All right. This is maybe a little heavier than usual, but hopefully to all of you who tuned in live and listening to it later, you found this valuable. If you can, please leave us a review and a comment wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, definitely leave us a comment. This will help us keep this going and figure out what we want to do with it and topics we want to talk about. Yeah. And with that, Gario and everybody else, we will see you all next week on another episode of Marketing Adjacent.
I feel like we should do more of these.